So we are in week 2 of a 3-week series we're doing here at Zion called Here's to Heroes, where we are just taking a few weeks to recognize and to honor and to celebrate and really to thank those who serve as heroes among us, because if there's one thing that this world really does need, it is a hero. Everybody's looking for a hero. Everybody's looking for a hero every single time somebody gets sick and they need a treatment or a surgery, they need some healing. They're looking for a hero that in our day and age we call a doctor or a surgeon or a nurse. Everybody's looking for a hero every single time something goes wrong, like a natural disaster happens, a hurricane blows in, or a tornado touches down, or maybe a terrible tragedy, an accident happens. Somebody gets into a car crash. Everybody's looking for a hero to pull the people from the rubble and to rescue them from the tragedy that has befallen them. We call these heroes first responders. You see, the good news about our world is that for all of its brokenness, there are real people who are real heroes, who are doing real good in a world that can sometimes feel real bad. And so it's just kind of appropriate that we take a moment to celebrate and honor these people. And today, as we continue our series, as Pastor Kevin mentioned, we're going to take a moment to honor and to recognize those who serve among us as caregivers. Now, sometimes caregiving is an actual profession. There are people who work in the medical profession as caregivers. There are people who work in the mental health profession as caregivers. There are people who work in skilled nursing as caregivers. But sometimes caregiving is not something that somebody does for a living. It is something that actually becomes really just their life, at least for a season of their life. I think of the husband who takes care of his wife because she's fallen really sick and she needs him now more than ever. Or I think about the daughter who's always there for her dad because he's kind of lost a step and he begins to forget things that once upon a time he was able to remember. Make no mistake about it, caregiving is very hard. In fact, it's so hard in a lot of ways, it's downright heroic. But here's the reality. Caregiving, even if we can't see it in the moment, makes a huge difference. And so what I want to do is I want to walk through and work through the story of a woman from the Bible, a woman from the Old Testament who is a terrific caregiver, and we're going to discover the incredible difference that she made. And maybe that will help us uncover the incredible difference that we can make when we are willing to give care. I'll begin just by setting a little bit of background here for you. Her story actually takes place in a pretty dark period in the history of the nation of Israel. It is a period known as the period of the Judges. Now, the Judges were people who lived in Israel and who ruled in Israel right after Israel had moved into the Promised Land, the modern-day nation of Israel, but before they had official kings to rule over the whole nation. And the fact that Israel did not have official kings to rule over the whole nation caused some problems. In fact, there is this refrain that pops up during this period over and over again when Israel only has judges. From Judges 21, verse 25, it says, "In those days, there wasn't any king in Israel." And here was the problem. Everybody just did whatever he wanted. In other words, the nation of Israel was kind of in a free fall, free for all. Because the only people that people cared about were themselves. The only people that people looked out for were themselves. They just did whatever they wanted. This was a very careless time, and yet, into the middle of this very careless time, steps a woman who is very care-filled. Her name is Ruth, and this is her story. Ruth 1, beginning at verse 1, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was no king in Israel. There was a famine in the land of Israel. So, a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, they decided that they were going to go and live for a while in the country of Moab." Story opens with a famine in the land of the nation of Israel. Now, I'm not even sure that we really have a frame of reference to really understand just how dangerous and damaging and downright deadly a famine could actually be. Because the worst thing that we ever experience in our day and age are supply chain issues. You know what those are, right? You go to HEB and you really want the organic carrots, but they only have the regular ones. And so you grumble just a little bit. A famine was much worse than a supply chain issue because it meant that when you went to the store, there wasn't just one item that was missing. There were no items that were available, and you would literally starve to death if you did not get food for your family. And so there is this man who is married. He has a wife, and he has 2 sons, and the grocery store shelves are completely empty, and he has to figure out how to put food on the table. And so he decides that he's going to take his wife and his kids, his wife and his sons, a little bit east to the land of Moab. Now, you need to know this kind of on background. The Moabites and the Israelites hated each other. They were always at war with each other. But here's the key. Moab had food. Israel didn't. And when you're a dad who's trying to keep your wife and your 2 sons from starving to death, you will do what you have to do. And so he goes to Moab, Ruth 1, verse 2. The man's name was Elimelech. By the way, remember that? That'll become important a little bit later. His wife's name was Naomi, and he had 2 sons. Their names were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, I want you to pick up on these names, Mahlon and Chilion. In ancient Hebrew cultures and in ancient Hebrew societies, a lot of times one of the things that you would do is you would give your kids names that actually reflected a characteristic that they had. And so in Hebrew, the name Mahlon, here's what it means: sickly. In Hebrew, the name Chilion, here's what that name means: wasting away. Kind of weird names to give to your boys, huh? Almost seems a little insulting. And yet these names probably said something about these boys. It seems as though from their very earliest years, these were kids who had a lot of medical issues. They were always in and out of doctor's offices. They were always on medications. They had had several surgeries, and yet nothing seemed to help them. Because there was something wrong not only medically, in this family, there was probably something wrong genetically passed down to these boys from their father. And so from their very earliest years, they were kind of in trouble from a health perspective, and eventually this family's medical and genetic problems begin to catch up with them. Because in Ruth 1, verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, his medical issues catch up with him, and he dies. And all of a sudden, his wife Naomi is left as a widow, taking care of 2 sons. Verse 4, these 2 sons, they eventually did grow up, and they married Moabite women because they were living in the region of Moab. One whose name was Orpah, and the other whose name was Ruth, the woman who kind of becomes the hero of this story. Well, after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion, their genetic and health issues catched up with them too, and they also died. And so now, not only is Naomi a widow, she's also childless. And she is left in the middle of Moab without her sons and without her husband. 3 verses in Ruth 1. 3 funerals in Naomi's life. Put yourself in her shoes for just a moment. Can you imagine how awful she must have felt? How depressed and despondent, hopeless and helpless she must have been. She's lost her whole family. Not only that, she's in the middle of a foreign land. In fact, finally, Naomi just can't take it anymore. And so she calls the only 2 people she knows in the region of Moab, her 2 daughters-in-law. She calls them to her and she says, I can't take this anymore. I got to go home. And my encouragement to you is that you do the same thing too. You go back to your Moabite households. It's probably best that all of us just get a fresh new start, and who knows, you may go back to your Moabite households, and you may find some new husbands to whom you can give your heart. Now, one of them, Orpah, she didn't like this. She shed some tears, but she realizes it's just kind of practical. This is what she has to do. And so she goes home to her Moabite household. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, she responds very differently. Ruth 1 verse 16, she says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go. And where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. Now, I got to tell you, I think these words from Ruth are some of the most beautiful words that have ever been spoken, not only in the pages of Scripture, but actually in all of history. And here's why. A lot of times we think the reason these words are beautiful is because most of the time, if you've gone to weddings, you may have heard these words before. Because these words are used at a lot of weddings. In fact, they almost sound like a wedding vow. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. We're going to be together until the day that death does us part. And weddings, just in general, are beautiful affairs. You got a beautiful bride and beautiful bridesmaids. You got a handsome groom and handsome groomsmen. You got cute little kids, ring bearers and flower girls. It's always a beautiful venue with beautiful music. You go into a beautiful reception hall. You eat beautiful food. You cut a beautiful cake. You dance to beautiful music. Everybody has a beautiful time, and that's why everybody cries at weddings, because everything is just so beautiful. But understand this. The way these words were originally spoken were in the middle of a context that was not beautiful at all. It was in the middle of a moment that was tragic. Ruth did not speak these words at the beginning of a romance. When Ruth spoke these words, it was because she was taking on an awesome responsibility. Because here's what she was saying to her mother-in-law. She was saying, no matter what, I will be there because I care for you. Ruth, when she said these words, here's what she was signing up to be. She was signing up to be a caregiver. And so the two of them, they go back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. Now, that was hard for Naomi because she had lost everything because of tragedy. But imagine how hard it was for Ruth because she was leaving her home by choice. They get back to Bethlehem, and when they arrive, it's the beginning of the barley harvest. Bethlehem was actually known for growing its barley, and this may have been the first barley harvest since the famine had subsided, so everybody was kind of excited. But these two women have a problem. They need to put food on the table, and they don't have husbands, they don't have a household, they don't have any money. And so what Ruth does is she hatches a plan. She says to her mother-in-law in verse 2 of Ruth 2, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain. I'm going to grab a bunch of Tupperware, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go scrounge through somebody else's leftovers. And so what she does is she goes out in verse 3, she enters a field, and she begins to glean behind the harvesters. Now, as it turns out, she was working to pick up leftovers in a field belonging to a man named Boaz, who just happened to be from the clan of, pick up on this name, Elimelech. Now, who is Elimelech? She was the deceased husband of Naomi. Now, what are the odds of this? Out of all the fields in all of Bethlehem, and there were quite a few barley fields in Bethlehem, Ruth just happened to stumble across a field that belonged to a member of her family. And so Ruth is out there trying to pick up any scrap of leftovers she can just to bring it home to her mother-in-law so they can at least have one meal. When Boaz, who is the foreman of the field, he sees there's a woman on the field. And this was a patriarchal society, which meant that didn't happen. Boaz sees what's going on, and Boaz's curiosity is piqued. So he goes to his guys and he says, hey, who's the girl? And his guys saw that it was odd too, so they went and they talked to her and they met her, and they say to Boaz, well, actually, that girl's name is Ruth. She's the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and Naomi was married to Elimelech, the man of whose clan you're a member. You actually went to his funeral. And so Boaz, he goes and has a quick conversation with Ruth, and he's so impressed by the way that Ruth is trying to take care of her mother-in-law that actually goes back to his guys. And he says to his guys, hey guys, why don't we make this a little easier on Ruth? Why don't we help her out a little bit? Ruth 2 verse 16, pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. When you're harvesting the fields, don't harvest it well. Pick up 2 stalks for you, leave 1 stalk for her. Pick up 2 stalks for you, leave 1 stalk for her. So Ruth gleans in the field until evening. As she threshes the barley, she separates the barley from the chaff, and by the time she was done, she actually got an ephah worth of threshed barley. Now, just to put that in modern day measurements, that'd be about 30 pounds. And just to give you a bit of perspective here, you go to H-E-B, buy a bag of flour, that weighs about 5 pounds. So in one day, Ruth gathers 6 bags of barley from the grocery store. You know what that'll make? A whole lot of pancakes, right? In fact, it's so heavy, it's not just that Ruth is carrying it like this. She has a bag of barley that's slung over her shoulder. She gets home to her mother-in-law at the end of the day, and her mother-in-law is shocked because she was expecting barely enough for a meal. Ruth comes home with enough pancakes for months. And so Ruth 2, verse 19, her mother-in-law says to Ruth, where did you go and glean today? Because you got to go back there. Where did you work? To which Ruth responds, the man with whom I work today, his name is Boaz. Now, it's at this moment, for the very first time in this story, that this woman, Naomi, goes from being completely depressed and completely despondent and completely hopeless and completely helpless to being just a little bit excited. And you can hear it in her voice. You can hear it in the way that she responds. Verse 20, the Lord bless him, Naomi says. That man is actually one of our relatives. In fact, more than that, he is one of our guardian redeemers. And I want you to pick up on the phrase guardian redeemer. In the Old Testament, a guardian redeemer was a member of a family who served a couple of very distinct roles. On the one hand, a guardian redeemer in an ancient Israelite family could be kind of today's version of a rich uncle. Anybody have one of those? The rich uncle is always the one who kind of steps in when somebody in the family needs help. And so, you got the college kid who gets like half the scholarship, but not the whole scholarship. So they still got $14 million worth of tuition to pay or however much it costs these days. And the rich uncle will step in and help out a little bit. That's one thing a guardian redeemer could do. And that's actually what Boaz has already done with Ruth and Naomi by giving Ruth all of that barley. But the other role that a guardian redeemer could play in the ancient world was that of an eligible bachelor. If somebody in a family was to suffer a tragedy, their husband was to die, the guardian redeemer could actually step in and stand in for that deceased husband and marry the widow. And it's right here that actually Naomi goes from being just excited to being just a little strategic. Because Boaz is single. And so Naomi talks to Ruth and she says, Boaz is a nice boy. In fact, here's what I want you to do, okay? Why don't you put on your best dress, take off those overalls. You've been working all day long. No. Go put on your best dress, spray on a little perfume. He's working late. It's barley time. And why don't you go out to the field tonight? See if he needs anything. And so Ruth thinks about it, and that's what she decides to do. She goes out to the field, but by the time she gets there, it's almost Boaz's bedtime, and he was working a long day, and so he actually just goes to sleep in the middle of the field. And so here's Ruth in this beautiful dress, but she hasn't gotten a date yet. And so here's what she decides to do. She just lays down at his feet while he's sleeping, snoozing, and she just stares at him. Now, in the middle of the night, something startles Boaz. The Bible doesn't tell us what startles Boaz, but something wakes him up. Maybe it was a coyote howling in the background. Maybe it was a little wind that chilled him a little bit, but something wakes him up. And all of a sudden, in the darkness, out of the darkness, he sees these two eyes that are staring at him. It freaks him out a little bit, and so he says in Ruth 3, verse 9, "Who are you?" And Ruth responds, "I am your servant Ruth." And then, I love this. She says, "Spread the corner of your garments over me." Let's go back to high school for just a second. Remember in high school how there were all these different groups and all these different cliques? You had, the nerds, and you had the chess club, and you had the glee club, and you had the preppy people, and you had the skaters, and then you also had the jocks. Maybe you were a jock. And if you were a big-time high school jock, maybe you played on the high school football team especially, you usually had a special kind of jacket that you would wear if you were really proud of your accomplishments. Had a big old letter right here on the chest. Anybody remember what you called those jackets? Letterman jackets. Now here's the thing. It wasn't just the high school jocks who would wear these jackets. Every once in a while, you'd be walking up and down the hallway of your high school, and you would see that there would be a girl who wasn't a jock who was wearing one of these jackets. In fact, she was wearing one of the jackets of the high school boys. All of a sudden, the captain of the cheerleading team was wearing the Letterman jackets of the captain of the football team. Now, you know what that was a sign and symbol of, right? The two of them were together. The two of them were a thing, were an item. It's the middle of the night, in the middle of a field, in the middle of Bethlehem. And here's Ruth. And she's looking at Boaz. And she says to Boaz, "So I see you were the captain of your high school football team. It's a nice jacket you got there. Mind if I wear it? Spread the corner of your garment over me," she says, "since you are a guardian redeemer of my family." I got to tell you, Ruth is awesome. Because she knows what she wants, and she's not afraid to ask. In fact, the only thing that is more awesome than Ruth and what she requests is Boaz's response to what Ruth requests. Because when you really stop to think about it, Boaz has no real good reason to say yes. This woman's a Moabite, he's an Israelite. If they got together, that'd cause a bit of a scandal. And it's not like she's rich. If they get together, he has to float all the bills, not only for her, but for her mother-in-law. Not only that, this woman has just recently lost her husband, so she's probably still grieving a little bit. This woman comes with a lot of what we would call in our day and age baggage, a lot of baggage. And so what's the temptation? Swipe left. No. But that's not what Boaz does. Boaz says, yes. Ruth 3, verse 11, "I will do for you all that you ask." And a story that begins as a tale of woe actually ends with a wedding. And I got to tell you, I think it's right here where this story gets very relevant and very practical for our lives. Because this story is incredible. It begins with a catastrophe. It turns into a love story. It begins as a tale of woe. It ends up as a story with a wedding. But here's where it all started. It all started with a woman who decided that she was going to dare to declare that no matter what, she would always be there for her mother-in-law just because she cares. That's how it all started. And so here's the question that we need to wrestle to the ground for ourselves. Who do you need to say Ruth's words to? Because whether you would consider yourself a caregiver or not, caregiving is a call that all of us have, because everybody needs somebody to care about them. Maybe it's that person who comes to church every Sunday. You see him, and they never really talk to anybody, and they always sit in a pew by themselves, and they get coffee, and then they just leave. You know what they need? Ruth's words. Where are you sitting today? I'll sit with you. Where you stay, I'll stay. You see, when you dare to show just a little bit of care, you never know where God might just take it from there. Maybe it's the person who's kind of like Naomi. They've lost everything. And they're in the middle of a tragedy, and it's shaking their faith. They wonder why God would allow this to happen to them. You know what they need? Ruth's words. Someone to come to them and to say, I don't have all the answers to all of your pain, but I do know this. I have a God who loves you, and my God can be your God too. Because when you dare to show just a little bit of care, you just never know where God might take it from there. Or maybe it's someone who has a Malin or a Killian in their life, and they're always sick. And the person who's caring for that Malin or that Killian is kind of at the end of their rope, and they're exhausted and they're tired. And what makes it even worse is that they're worried that no matter how much care they give, in the end, it's not going to end up well. You know what that person needs? Ruth's words. Someone to come to them and to say to them, you know what? Because of God, not even death can separate you from me and you from them, because God has promised eternity. And you never know with those words. You never know what that little bit of care might do as God takes it from there. Who do you need to say Ruth's words to? Because just a little bit of care can make a real big difference in somebody's life. Now, before we conclude, I got to tell you the rest of the story, because there is a little bit more to this story. In fact, the story kind of winds up traditional. You know the way the story goes. First comes love. The two of them fall in love. Then comes marriage. The two of them get married. Then comes the what? Baby and the baby. You graduated from kindergarten too. Good job. So Ruth and Boaz, they get married. 9 months later, here comes bouncing baby boy, Obed. And actually, the book of Ruth ends with a little family tree. It ends with a genealogy. Ruth 4, verses 21 and 22. Boaz, Ruth's husband, becomes the father of Obed. Obed grows up. He becomes the father of a guy named Jesse. Jesse grows up. He becomes the father of a guy named David. As in King David, the most famous king in the history of the nation of Israel. You see, what begins in a period where Israel has no king, and so everybody's just caring for themselves and about themselves, it ends up as a story about the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. But it all starts with a woman who would dare to declare that no matter what, she would be there for her mother-in-law just because she cares. It turns out that Ruth's caregiving had a profound impact on history. Because without Ruth, there would be no David. But, it actually goes even deeper than that. Because over 1,000 years after we get this little genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth, this same genealogy, this same family tree comes up and pops up again, except this time it's at the beginning of the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 1, verses 5 and 6, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. There it is. Boaz and Ruth, they have Obed. Obed grows up. He becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of King David. It's the same as Ruth 4, verses 21 and 22. So what's new? You know who this family tree belongs to? At the very beginning of the genealogy tells us, Matthew 1, verse 1, it says, this is the genealogy of who? Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah, a son of David. It turns out that just like David was a son of Ruth, Jesus was a son of David. It turns out that Ruth's caregiving not only had an impact on history, it resounds all the way into eternity. Listen, I know that caregiving is hard. And so if you're here and you are a caregiver, here's what I want to say. Thank you. We care about you, but even more than that, Jesus does too. Which is why he says to you, where you go, I'll go. Even if it's to a hospital to be by somebody's bedside. And where you stay, I'll stay. Even if it's up all night because the person you're caring for can't sleep. And if you feel alone and you feel isolated because you're always offering care to this one person, guess what? I have a people, and my people can be your people. And when you feel like not even God notices, I know God, and he does notice, and my God will be your God. And may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if it means nails through my hands and death on a cross. If I let anything, including death, separate you from me and my love, because that's how much I care. Let's wrap up with a verse. 1 Peter 1, verse 7. When you feel overwhelmed because you got so much to do and so many people to care for, take all of that and just cast it all on him. Why? Because he what? Cares for you. This is most certainly